Have you ever walked into a room and smelled something or seen something that triggered a memory? Remembrance is powerful. And today we're going to talk about remembering Jesus and his sacrifice through the act of communion. One of my favorite movies from childhood is the movie Hook, which tells the story of a grown-up Peter Pan who rediscovers his childhood, rediscovers his boyhood by going back to Neverland and rescuing his kids from the horrible Captain Hook. What I love about this movie is so many things. It's the story of a man who has lost his innocence, who's lost his joy, who's lost his sense of purpose, who's lost his own son's heart. So there's so many things in this story that we could find a lot of meaning in. But there's one scene that I absolutely love, and that's the scene where Peter shows up. He's in Neverland. He hasn't really figured out who he really is yet. He doesn't know that he was the famous Peter Pan who could fly, who could beat Captain Hook at any turn. He hasn't figured that out yet, but he's trying to rediscover it. And he shows up to this meal with the Lost Boys. He's starving and shows up ready to eat. But to his dismay, the table is empty. There's bowls, there's plates, there's spoons, but there's no food. All around him, the Lost Boys are eating, but they're eating imaginary food. And he's just miserable because he doesn't get how this is a real feast. In this scene, there's a point where Peter starts to have a banter back and forth with another lost boy. And at first it starts out kind of mild, but eventually he starts to kind of play the game and get into the mood of the joy of this feast. And in this exchange that gets a little heated and fun, he pulls back a spoon and he flicks at this other lost boy imaginary something. And in that act, the imaginary food suddenly becomes real and it splatters all over. It starts this massive food fight, and suddenly Peter finds himself. He remembers. He remembers who he was. The act of remembrance is so powerful. Remembering is so important. The reason I told that story from that movie is that we were made to remember. We were made to experience remembrance. Today, I want to talk about communion and what communion does for us in remembrance. You know, I grew up in a church environment where we took communion a lot. If you're watching this and you are a Christian and maybe have grown up in the church world, you probably have had communion. You've probably done it a lot of different ways, maybe going to the front at church, maybe at someone's house. For me growing up, I took communion probably once a week at church, maybe 2 times a week on a Wednesday night service as well. And for me, communion was always represented by a tiny little cup, plastic cup of juice and a little old stale wafer. And I can remember as a little girl not really understanding how drinking a tiny cup of juice and a little wafer would help me understand the act of communion or what the Last Supper that it represented. I kind of got it, but not really. As an adult, I have come to really deeply treasure this liturgy or this practice of communion because of what it represents in our faith. Jesus invited his disciples into remembrance on the night before he was betrayed and he went and he died. This story is so common. We've heard it so many times for many of us who have grown up in the church that it often loses its power, its potency. But what I want to do maybe here today is invite you into this story in a meaningful, gritty, earthy way that helps our hearts connect to the remembrance of Jesus. Jesus, let's set the scene. It's Passover. They're sitting at a table. What we know had just happened right before was they had entered up into this room and the mood was heavy. The disciples probably knew that there was something on Jesus' heart, but they couldn't maybe put a name to it. They'd come up to this room to celebrate Passover together, and there was no one to wash their feet. Their feet were so dirty, they couldn't come into the meal unclean. And Jesus had gotten down on his knees. He had taken off his outer garment, wrapped it around himself, and he had washed his disciples' feet. He had done this act of servanthood. Then they gather around a table and they start to eat together. And while they're eating, Jesus passes the wine and he passes the bread and he says, "This wine is representative of my blood, which will be poured out for you. And this bread that is broken is my body that is broken for you." Remember, the disciples did not know, had not experienced what they were just about to experience, which was Jesus, his body being broken, beaten, whipped, torn apart, and his blood being poured out. This act of atonement, which is so profound and so central to everything in our faith, was about to be done in just several hours from then. In this act, though, Jesus was sitting with his friends, and he said to them, he said, "I have longed to eat this meal with you. I've longed to eat this meal with you." And as you eat together, Jesus knowing what was about to come, in the future, when you gather together and you eat together, you are going to remember. When you break the bread, when you touch it, when you drink the wine, when you pass it around, you're going to smell it. You're going to feel it. You're going to see those around you and their eyes, and you're going to touch it together, and you are going to remember. And what I want you to remember is I want you to remember me. I want you to remember what I have done for you. Communion is the act of remembrance. Not only do we give mental assent to what Jesus has done, but we enter into an experience of remembering who we are in Jesus because of his sacrifice. Today, I want you to just be invited into maybe a new way or a refreshed way of engaging with the act of communion. Maybe your heart has grown a little bit cold to remembrance. Or maybe your heart has never really experienced that flesh and blood, gritty, earthy sense of Jesus. He wants you to. He wants you to know him in that way. In that way. That's why he came as a man. I just invite you today to ask Jesus to come to you that way and ask him to help your heart open up to the remembrance of who he is so that you can find yourself in the story of who he has made you to be in him. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, check out more, hit subscribe so you can be notified every time we send out more videos like this.